Welcome Beetle Ute builders. This video is on wiring options in the bed area. There's a whole lot of stuff to cover, but I'm gonna try to be methodical as I can and still cover some of the options. Those of you that are familiar with wiring and using resistors and soldering stuff up probably don't need this video. This is probably aimed more at those that don't mess with wiring all that much. But everybody is welcome, of course. The one main thing that everybody's going to have to worry about wiring on is taillights. But then that breaks down into two categories. If you're going to use a tail light, not the tail light with the kit, all right, not the little round 2-inch pucks that come with the kit, but you're going to do another light that has an independent turn signal and brake light. Really all you have to do is tap into the existing wiring for the lights that you're putting on the kit. But that's probably not very many people. Most of the aftermarket lights that people are going to use are a brake light and turn signal as one filament. So that's why Mark includes this 5-wire to 4-wire converter, right, which is actually for wiring up trailers in the kit. And this does the ticket. This works out real well. We're going to have to combine that 5 wires into 4 wires using this converter that comes with the kit. And it's fairly simple. There's directions here on, let me get that on there, all right. Focus, are we gonna get a focus? I don't know if we're gonna get a focus. But that gives you the connections there. So that goes to the car, and this says to trailer, but really that's gonna be to your new lights, right? The lights that you're adding. So 5 wires come in because there's an independent turn signal, and 4 wires come out. So that's pretty easy to wire out to your new lights. All right. So we'll get to how to solder this in. I like to do it right in this area, right back here, because then once the bed is in, I can tuck this up. By the way, I choose to do the wiring before the bed goes on because it's easier access to everything, and I can make sure I get it all right and route everything. So you can do this after the bed is on, but it's a little more difficult. And access to this piece of this stretch of wiring is very difficult once the bed is on. So I recommend you do the wiring the next step after cutting the car. Here's another option that some of us have the monsoon system and some of us don't. If you don't have the monsoon system, which means there's an amplifier that sits here and maybe a CD player that sits here, you can ignore this part. If you do have that, here is my approach for what I like to do. So there's 2 giant connectors on the monsoon amplifier. I simply unwind this all the way back and take those wires out of this loom and leave those coiled up underneath the seat. And then when I get to that stage, I put the amp under the seat with these wires. Okay, there's plenty of other ways to tackle it. One of them is, hey, I want to delete my amp. You can delete the amp, but if you'll notice, the twisted pairs coming into this green connector, those are all your speaker leads. So if you delete your amplifier, you have to rewire all your speakers. Because the radio, in the monsoon system, the radio sends the sound back to the amp amplifies it, and then sends it out to the 6 or 8 channels, however many speakers there are in the system. So all of those speaker leads come out of this connector. So you can delete the amp, but I find it's easier just to tuck it up under the seat than to rewire all those speakers. It's up to you how you want to do it. A aftermarket radio will work fine with this amp, but you're probably going to need a little help with that wiring. If you are interested in that, I recommend you just go to Crutchfield. You put in your year of car and say with monsoon system and look at aftermarket stereos. They'll tell you all the extra little bits you need to include, it's about $30 if I remember right, a wiring harness adapter for the monsoon system so that it all still works. And the amplifier is actually a pretty good system. The sound is very nice. All right, if you have the CD changer, that plug normally sits right here. And that is, where is my, here it is. Normally it routes up over this support that later on we'll have to dent in. And I don't know, what is that, 16 lead, I think? It's a 12 pin connector. I personally delete the CD players unless who's ever going to end up with a car, I'm sorry, the CD changer. It's I believe it's a 6 or 8 CD changer. Very few people use CDs anymore, so nobody really misses it. And I really like the Bluetooth adapter that you plug into the factory stereo, but it doesn't allow you the use of the CD player anyway. You unplug the CD leads out of the back of the factory stereo and plug in this Bluetooth adapter, and then your phone plays and you can listen to Pandora or your musics or your iTunes or whatever you got on your phone. And that's a pretty cool system. So in general, I delete this. If you want to keep the CD changer, do the same thing as you're going to do with the monsoon system, or with the amp leads. As you're unwinding that loom, take that section and bring that into the cab and just set it under the seat next to the amplifier, and that will solve that issue. Unwinding that loom is kind of a messy job because everything's very sticky and you're taking off a lot of tape. There's a million different ways you could do it. You can just unwind the tape. That takes you a little while. I prefer to cut it, but you have to be very careful when you're cutting it that you are not cutting a wire. If you nick a wire, then that circuit may not work, and coming back and finding that can be a headache. So I recommend against using a knife to cut through all that tape. I like to use a small scissor, kind of like a cuticle scissor, and that way I can control it and be very careful not to snip a wire. But even with the scissors, you still got to be careful as you're going. So you'll see that I'm being very careful. Now that we have all those other wires pulled out of the bundle here, this is much less intimidating bundle to work with. So let's get into installing the converter. All right, this is the converter that comes with the kit. It's labeled to the car and to the trailer. So where it says to the trailer, just think in your head, think new lights. So this is what goes to the harness here. And I like to wire it so it sits back in this corner, and you can even take off the double stick tape and get it to mount up on the sidewall there a little bit underneath that edge of the bed that's going to be over it, so it stays out of the water. So you kind of get this harness to where you have enough wire that you know it's going to fit. There's plenty of wire in here. We're going to actually hack off quite a bit of these. That white ground has a nice connector already on it, so I usually solder that in and add a ground back here just to make sure I'm getting good ground. The kit comes with crimp connectors that have the nice shrink wrap, shrink tubing on them, so you can use those, but I'm a solder guy, so I'm going to solder and shrink tubing all these connections. So I just start at the top on the two-car side first. All right, so I'm looking for the green wire. Well, let's cut these back. All right, so I'm just gonna think about, yeah, right about there ought to give me plenty of wire. So I'm gonna cut that whole harness off right there. Okay, so I got the car end of the converter all prepped. I got my shrink tubing on, which is only necessary if you're gonna solder. If you're gonna use the crimp connectors, just strip you a little bit back on each side, and I stripped each wire. I'm going to start at the top there, and it says right turn, and it's the green wire. Well, I looked at the right turn signal connector, and it's the black with green. So you look in the harness here that goes out to the right and follow it up, and here's that black with green stripe wire. Now, this one we're okay. There's not another one in the harness that's black with green. Some of the wires we'll get into, and I'll point them out. There's 2 wires with the same color code. But on this one, we don't have to worry about it. So all we got to do is leaving ourselves enough wire so we can put this where we want. Cut that wire, strip it, and connect it to the green one. So that's the first wire. The second wire is the red going into the converter, and that is the stop. So we know these 2 red and blacks coming back here, because I've looked at both sides. One of them goes to the right and one of them goes to the left, and at this T here. So it doesn't matter which one you cut into. We're going to end up cutting them both on the outbound leg. So we're going to take one that's about the same length here. Next wire on the converter is yellow, which is left turn. So I look at my left turn signal connector, and it's black with a white stripe. So I look into this harness here for the black with a white stripe. There it is. I look through the rest of the harness. There's not another one, so I know I've got the right one. And I can see that it goes directly through, so I know I've got the right one. So I go ahead and connect those. Next connector, brown wire, and that goes to the tail lights. So this one's a little bit tricky, because if you notice, on the marker light, it's gray with black, and on the tail light connector, it's gray with black. So what that means is there's 2 wires in this bundle that are tail lights, and we need to make sure we get the right one, because otherwise you're going to end up with your marker light working and not your tail light working when you cut into this harness to actually wire the lights up. So it's a 50-50 shot, right? So I use my ohm meter. I use my multimeter. Put one probe into the connector there. Continuity check. Take the other lead. And I've already cut one, but you can just stick the tip of your probe, or you can take a pin and stick it in. You want to just, oh, wrong end. You want to check your continuity. There we go, good continuity. So I know I've cut the right light, or the right wire rather. So now I'm going to connect this to tail lights, which is the brown wire. The next connection, and this is the last one on the car end, is the white wire, which is ground. So I like to pull a little trick here, and I use the piece that we cut off that has the grommet on it. That's not really called a grommet, but... And I make a 3-way connection here. Right there is a bundle here of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. There's 12 ground wires here that we can choose from. But they all come back to these 2, and this that fastens back to the frame. I would recommend picking one of the big ones and using that. So I'm going to pick the biggest one out of the bundle here and use that. So now we have all the connections done to the car end of the converter. I'm going to pause the camera, go ahead and clean these up, inspect them, make sure they're good, and shrink wrap them. You don't need to watch me with the heat gun. And then we'll tackle this piece. So I got those connections gooped up and shrunk tubing. One little tip for those that are new to trying to make weather resistant connections: before you slide the shrink tubing up, I like to use dielectric grease. You can also use liquid electrical tape. 800% silicone works pretty well too. You goop a little bit of it on there, slide the shrink tubing on, and then as the shrink tubing shrinks, it'll ooze out both ends, kind of makes a mess, but that seals it nicely. Makes a more of a weather resistant, because this area will be exposed to some weather. It's not bad in this compartment, but it will be moisture. So the next step is the lights section. All right, and the plug on here you may recognize just as a trailer plug. If you're gonna put a hitch on, you wanna save that pigtail and solder it in as you're soldering in the tail light connections. I'm gonna put a light bar underneath the tailgate on this car, and it has a connector like this to plug in and simplifies the wiring. So I'm gonna cut this harness coming out of the converter, maybe 18 inches there, just long enough so I can have room to get it here, and then solder these wires back in as I'm making those connections, so they'll all be three-way connections. So we'll go ahead and cut that. I'm gonna go ahead and strip these, get my shrink tubing on, and then we'll come back and find which wires these need to go to. Tails are all ready to go. So now I'm gonna go in the same process. I'm just gonna start with the first wire, find what one I need to go to, connect it, and on down the way. So the green wire outbound, which says to trailer, but we're reading that as to the lights. The top wire there is green, and it says to the right stop and turn light, because now that one bulb is gonna function as a stop light and a turn signal. So we have to find the red with black stripe wire that goes to the right hand or the passenger side stop or brake light. So remember, we had that three-way back here, and we cut one of them. Let me move these out of the way. We cut one of them, and that was the one that continues over to the right. So here's our black with red. If you are in doubt, you can use your multimeter and check it at the terminal. So we're gonna connect that one. Okay, wire number 2 coming out of the converter is yellow, and it's the left stop turn. So now we need the red and black that goes to this left side, or the driver's side. I didn't cut that one yet, so I need to cut it here. And I need to remember to come back and cap this from where I just cut, because that will still be getting power whenever you hit the brake lights or the turn signal from the car. So that one needs to be treated. So let's join the yellow from the trailer pigtail, the yellow from the converter, and the left stop turn. So the next wire is the brown, which says tails. Now this is a little bit more tricky, because you have two separate tail lights and you don't have one wire going to both of them. So we have to bring a wire from the right tail light and a wire from the left tail light. We clipped the wire from the left tail light to give the input signal to the converter. So we know that this gray with the black stripe here goes to the left tail light. Remember, we used the ohm meter to double check that. Now we need to find the tail light wire that goes to the right tail light. The problem is there are two wires here. It's gray with a small red stripe, because the marker light and the tail light on the right hand side both have the same color code. So there's two wires here and I don't know which one goes to the right hand tail light. So I put my ohm meter into the connector over there on the right hand side of the car. I'm going to take the other lead off my ohm meter, set to ohms. I don't know if you could see it. And now I'm going to pierce the insulation on here to see which one has continuity with the other connector. Oh, and I got lucky, it was the first one. So now I know that this gray wire with the red stripe goes to the right hand tail light. So I'm going to cut this one up here a little bit. This is going to be a little bit of a confusing connection because it's actually going to be 4 wires. Let's get the multimeter out of the way. So we have the brown wire supplying signal for the tail lights to come on, coming from the converter. We have the 2 wires that go to the 2 tails, and then we have the brown wire that I want to add to my pigtail for the trailer. So I'm going to join all 4 of those. Okay, and the last connector we have is the white ground. So I mentioned before that I like to overkill on the grounds, and when we bolt in the bed, we're going to have this bolt right here that bolts the rear plate, the rear floor panel of the bed. We're going to put a long bolt and a nut on there. That's going to be a great ground. So I added, from the harness that we took out of the hatch, it had a nice little connector ground wire that I can fit onto that new bolt when I get to the grounds. So I added that through my shrink tubing here. So when we're all done, I can ground that here. So now I have 3 wires to connect for the ground. I have the white from the pigtail that goes to the trailer, which again, if you don't need that, leave that out. And then the white coming from the converter, and then the little pigtail that I'm going to bolt to ground. So I have those 3 wires to join here. So now we have all our connections made. One thing I forgot to mention, if you're using LEDs and the kit lights are LEDs, you're going to get hyper flash on your turn signals. They go tick, 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 really fast instead of the normal tick, 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 because you're using LEDs, which is such a low draw. So to combat that, there's a couple different ways to fix that hyper flash. One is to put a resistor in. And I should have mentioned this when we were soldering the inbound wires. If you're gonna solder in resistors, I recommend doing that on the inbound side of the converter, because you only need the resistor on the turn signal. You need to add a load to the turn signal to slow down that flash. So I would add that to the right turn and the left turn, which is the inbound green and yellow wires. If you're going to use the resistor method, you have to put a resistor from this joint to ground. So you can either go to a ground wire, or you can put a pigtail on your resistor that then when you put the ground back in, and you need one on each of those. Remember that those resistors are going to get really hot when the turn signals are on. So when you're laying your wire where you want it to be, you need to mount those resistors somewhere where they won't end up in the harness, or they'll melt through the other wires in the harness and short out all your lights, which is a bummer. My preferred technique is to get the anti-hyperflash hazard switch from a guy on Facebook named Matthew Litke. He does beautiful electrical work for Mark IVs and Mark Vs and even Mark VIs. So if you search on Facebook, Clusters by Litke, he sells them for the, and there's two types of switches in the Beetles. The 99 to 05 has the vertical switch that's underneath the radio in that lower panel. And the 06 to 010 have the triangle switch that's up on the dash. So make sure you order the right one, and they're different prices. Or you can remove yours and send it to him, and he'll charge you 15 bucks to fix it and send it back to you. That's the way I prefer. It's a whole lot cleaner. You're not worried about the resistors back here melting through anything. You're not worried about getting the right size resistors. Can they handle the load, etc. So I prefer the anti-hyper flash switch. The VWs are weird that it doesn't have a relay. Like most cars just have a relay that you plug in for your flasher somewhere up under the dash. In the VWs, it's all in the hazard switch. So you got to replace that hazard switch if you're going to use that method. So I'm going to clean these up, inspect them, goop them up, and shrink wrap them, and then we'll come back and go to testing. The last step is to actually wire up the lights. I use a spade connector or a bullet connector on these. Cut this original tail light connector off and then put the other end of the spade or bullet connectors on, so these will plug together. You can cut away your turn signal lead because that's no longer needed. And then for the backup lights, you'll see where they came down, and hopefully you marked them as you were taking them out. Right, so there's my backup light. I'm just going to cut that connector off, strip those two wires, and hook those to the backup lights that I'm going to use. And then the same for the license plate lights. So it's pretty simple at this point. I recommend putting either bullet or spade connectors on instead of hard wiring because you'll need those. But temporarily, just so we can test this now before we go any further, because I really don't want to hook up all those lights until I get the fenders on. And then get them placed, and then I know if I need to extend that harness or I need to cut it back, what have you. So just for testing purposes, I'm going to take the kit lights, and remember the wiring code is different. You've got to plug this in correctly. It will physically plug in the wrong way, but that can blow up or burn out your light. So you got to look for the little negative. There's a negative and a positive cast into the plastic. The negative has to be towards the non-wire end there. Mark's got a little video on it if you need more info. So plug them in, and now you've got 3 leads. Now remember, our wiring coding has changed. And on these lights, red is turn signal and brake, brown is tail, and white is ground. So this is more in line with the wiring code for the harness, for the converter. Brown on the VW is ground, but this brown is actually your tail. So just for testing purposes, I stripped them back a little bit, wound them up real hard, and I'm just going to push them into the connector here so we can turn on the lights and see if these guys are working, if we got our wiring done right. So the red is brake and tail, so that goes to the red with black stripe. Brown is tail light. So that goes on this side, it's gray with a black stripe. And then the white is the ground. So it goes to the middle pin, which is a brown wire on the other end, on the VW end. So just temporarily putting those in there, put a little clamp on here so we can see the light. Remember to hook up your grounds. So I took the ground, I'm gonna have to tilt this down a little bit. I took the ground wire that I added coming out to a stud that's right here. Just put a nut on it, one of the nuts that I had taken off the car, taking the car apart. Remember to clean the paint off, and it's not a bad idea to put a little dab of conductive grease on it. And then the other 2 grounds I temporarily put here for right now. It's basically a riv nut. Remember to take the paint off so it gets a good connection. And just put another one of the little bolts I found. Later on, I'll move that up because if it's on the floor, water will tend to collect and corrode it. So I like to move them up off the floor if possible. It's not that big a deal. There's another stud back in here that you could use. This one I'll probably cut off. when I start fitting, because I think I'm actually going to have to trim this back a little bit. So remember to hook up your grounds, and obviously you got to hook up the battery to the car. I had the battery unhooked while I was cutting the car. So let me go hook up the battery. I'm going to move the camera back so we can see the lights, and we'll give her a quick test. All right, so everything is set up. I hooked in my little light strip that's going to go underneath the tailgate here into the plug that I wired in. It's basically, it's a trailer plug. So I get to test that at the same time. So left tail light and stop turn, right tail light, stop turns. So let me go turn it on and see what happens. Keep your fingers crossed. All right, turn the lights on. And there we have it, all right? Left tail light, right tail light. By the way, the markers are still working if you want to add markers. I'm not going to, so later on I'll snip that and waterproof the edges. Tail light strip is working okay. This marker is still working also, okay? So that's tail lights. Let's test brake. Everything seems to be working. So key on, and let's try the turn signals. Oh, and you can see I got this backwards. So that is actually supposed to lay in here that way. Okay, and there you can see that's the hyper flash because I haven't put the switch in yet. So that's what I was talking about needing the resistors for. Let's try the right turn signal. Okay, everything seems to be working. So hopefully that helped you figure out how to wire in the converter. The rest of it is just putting bullet connectors or spade connectors that you can get anywhere. I would recommend getting the weather resistant ones that have the kind of like this pink stuff on the crimp connectors that come with the kit. The connectors do not come with the kit to actually hook up your lights. So you got to go down to Ace or Lowe's or wherever you go. You can go to Napa or what have you. I recommend the little bit better quality ones that then you hit with the heat gun or a hairdryer to shrink that in, and putting a little dab of dielectric grease in the connector before you put it together. But that's basically how you do the wiring. Now I just got to loom this all back up and tuck it away and then run that wiring up underneath the carpet. So there's a lot of little custom options you can run off of this. I'm not going to attempt to cover those all. If you follow on the Facebook tech support page, the Smyth Performance tech support page, everybody posts with the little things that they do about how they ran the bed lights and what have you. I'll probably make another video on that later on. But for right now, this will get you the main part. I recommend doing this wiring and then re-looming this before you put the bed on. It's just better access. Okay, afterthought. I thought you might want to see it all loomed back up. So obviously I've loomed up the cross. I took these little clips that were on there, opened them up a little bit so the loom fits in them, tucked them up under the way, out of the way, and when that rear floor panel goes on, that will cover this and you won't see that. For the license plate lights, right, they used to come through a grommet that was right here, but we've cut that out. So I punch a hole in this grommet here once I cut those connectors off and push the wires through that grommet, and that brings it out just under the bumper here, right there, and that's a pretty convenient place to bring those out. Tuck all this up in the corner there. You can put it up on a little block if you want to keep it up out of the water a little bit, but that corner ends up being pretty protected, and then it's loomed all the way back. I still have to move that ground there. I'm going to just move it up here. If you are going to do a hitch, or you need to bring that trailer plug out, you can do that same thing, go through that same grommet. I'm going to bring it up in the corner here where it'll connect to the lights that run across the top of the roll pan there. Anyway, that's what it looks like all buttoned back up, and things are a little bit neater. that's my techniques. Take it or leave it. I hope it helps you. Thanks for watching. As always, I can use a like and subscribe on my YouTube channel. Appreciate it.